She walked into that house to clean it. She walked out of it completely undone. Fiona Bridges had spent years being the woman nobody really looked at, the one who showed up, did the work, and disappeared before anyone noticed she was there. She was good at that. Invisible was safe. Invisible didn't hurt. But the night she stepped into that mansion on the hill, something shifted. Because someone was already in the dark. And he wasn't just looking at her. He was watching her, the way a man watches something he's been waiting for, without knowing it. Caius Macias had built an empire out of silence and control. He didn't do feelings. He didn't do softness. And he absolutely did not do the kind of thing that happens when a woman with tired eyes and quiet hands walks into your home and suddenly makes it feel like one. This story is about two people who had no business falling for each other, and fell anyway, hard and slow and completely. If you're watching this for the first time, subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from today. Now let's get into it. Seoul had that kind of October cold that doesn't ask permission. Fiona Bridges sat in the back of the company car at 8:14 p.m., watching a rain-blurred city slide past the window, a new address on her phone, and a feeling in her stomach she decided to call hunger. She'd been reassigned that morning. No explanation, no client name, just an address in Yongsan-gu, an access code that changed weekly, and a note that said, "Premium account, discretion required." In 5 years of working for Elysian Home Services, Fiona had learned that discretion required meant one of two things. Either the client was famous, or the client was the kind of person who didn't need to be. She was 27 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Back in Cincinnati, her mother had a neurologist appointment on Thursday that Fiona had already paid for and couldn't attend. Her brother Eli had texted 3 times that week, twice asking for encouragement, once asking for money. She'd sent all 3. And somewhere in a drawer in her old bedroom, tucked under a stack of design books she no longer let herself open, was an acceptance letter from a program in Chicago that she'd folded so many times the creases had turned white. She didn't think about that drawer. She was good at not thinking about it. The car stopped at a gate she almost didn't see. Black iron, no nameplate, swallowed by old pine trees that lined a private road like they were keeping a secret. The driver didn't speak. He just waited until the gate opened on its own, then pulled through without a word. The mansion revealed itself slowly, the way expensive things often do. A stone facade, floor-to-ceiling windows with the lights mostly off. A long entrance that felt less like a welcome and more like a warning. Fiona stepped out with her supply bag and stood for a moment in the drizzle, taking it in. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a place someone had built to prove they didn't need one. Inside, the air was cooler than she expected, and heavy with the faint smell of cedarwood and something darker underneath, like old leather, like the memory of smoke. The rooms were immaculate, but oddly still, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from emptiness, but from discipline. Someone lived here, someone who had decided that living didn't require warmth. Fiona moved through the space with the quiet efficiency that had become her second language. She adjusted, she polished, she straightened things that were already straight, out of habit. In the main sitting room, a single lamp had been left on, throwing a long amber shadow across a reading chair with a book left open on the armrest. She glanced at the title without meaning to. Meditations, Marcus Aurelius, bookmarked somewhere in the middle. She filed that away without knowing why. She was in the hallway outside the study when she felt it, the specific, unmistakable weight of being watched. Not the paranoid kind, the real kind. The kind that presses between your shoulder blades like a hand that isn't touching you yet. Fiona turned. He was standing at the far end of the corridor, half dissolved in shadow, arms crossed, completely still. Dark suit, no tie, the kind of face that didn't apologize for itself. And he was looking at her. Not with surprise, not with suspicion, just looking. Steady and direct and entirely unbothered by the fact that she'd caught him. She forgot, for exactly 1 full second, how to breathe. He didn't move, he didn't speak, and somehow that was worse. Fiona turned back to her work, heartbeat loud in her own ears, and told herself it meant nothing, that he was just a client, that she was just a maid. That the way he'd looked at her was probably how he looked at everything, like he was deciding whether it was worth his attention. What she didn't know yet was that he'd already decided. She came back the following Tuesday, and the Tuesday after that. Elysian had officially assigned her to the Yongsan property on a weekly rotation, and Fiona had accepted the news with a professional nod that revealed nothing of the way her pulse had behaved for 3 days straight every time she thought about that hallway, about the shadow at the end of it, about the way he'd looked at her like she was something worth the patience of a long, unhurried look. She told herself she was being dramatic. She was good at talking herself out of things. His name, she'd learned from the brief she wasn't supposed to read too carefully, was Caius Macias. That was all the file gave: a name, a property address, a billing account with no company attached. The kind of client who paid in full, in advance, and asked no questions, because he was already the one with all the answers. On her second visit, the mansion felt different in daylight. Less like a warning, more like a challenge. The windows let in a cold, clean October light that caught the edges of everything. The dark wood furniture, the framed artwork that was expensive without being decorative, the half-empty glass of water on the kitchen counter that told her he'd been there recently. She noticed things like that. She always had. It was the part of her that had wanted to study design, the part that read spaces like other people read faces. This space said, controlled, deliberate. And somewhere underneath all that discipline, quietly, almost reluctantly, lonely. She was reorganizing the bookshelf in the study when she heard him. Not footsteps exactly, more like the particular quality of silence that changes when someone enters a room. She didn't turn around immediately. She finished aligning the spine of a book, studied her breathing, and then turned with the calm expression she'd spent years perfecting. He was leaning against the doorframe with a cup of coffee, watching her with that same unhurried attention from before. In daylight, he was somehow worse, or better, depending on how honest she was willing to be with herself. The kind of face that made you forget what you were about to say. Sharp jaw, dark eyes that held a steadiness that felt almost unfair. The kind of composed that doesn't come from ease, but from years of deciding not to flinch. "You moved the Aurelius," he said. His English was clean, slightly low, with a cadence that carried traces of somewhere else underneath it. Fiona blinked. "I put it with the philosophy section. It was on the armrest. I know where I left it." There was no sharpness in his tone. That was the thing that caught her off guard. He wasn't annoyed. He was just stating a fact, watching her process it with something that looked almost like curiosity. Like he was less interested in the book and more interested in what she'd do next. She reached over, pulled the Aurelius from the shelf, and set it back on the armrest of the reading chair without a word. He looked at the book, then back at her. The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, something smaller, and somehow more dangerous than a smile would have been. "You can leave it there," he said. And then he walked away, taking his coffee and that almost smile with him. And Fiona stood in the study with the distinct, unsettling feeling that she had just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. She thought about that almost smile for the entire drive home, She thought about it while she heated soup for dinner, while she called her mother, while she lay in the dark of her small apartment in Mapogu, staring at the ceiling with her hands folded over her stomach. She was not the kind of woman men like that noticed. She knew that. She'd been told that, in various gentle and not so gentle ways, for most of her adult life. Too quiet, too serious, the kind of pretty that doesn't announce itself. What she didn't know, what she couldn't see from where she was standing, was that across the city, in a house built for solitude, Caius Macias was sitting in that reading chair, with the Aurelius open in his lap, and not reading a single word of it. The third visit fell on a Thursday, which meant Fiona arrived earlier than usual. The company had a same-day deep clean request added to her schedule. No reason given, just a timestamp and the familiar code. She told herself the small lift in her chest when she saw the address was just relief at the extra hours. The overtime would help with her mother's next appointment. That was all it was. She was very certain of that for approximately 4 minutes, which was how long it took her to reach the gate and remember the almost smile. The house was quieter that morning. No coffee cup on the counter, no open book on the armrest, no particular quality of charged silence announcing that he was nearby. Just the pale November light coming through the tall windows and the sound of her own footsteps on the stone floor. She moved through the rooms methodically, the way she always did, but something about his absence made the space feel different, larger somehow, and more revealing. She noticed things she'd cataloged but not fully considered before. The way the bookshelves were organized, not by genre or author, but by some internal logic she couldn't quite decode. The single framed photograph on the desk in the study. Not a family portrait, not a landmark. Just a coastline she didn't recognize, shot at dusk, the horizon sitting exactly in the middle of the frame, like someone had needed the world to be perfectly divided. She didn't touch it, but she looked at it longer than she should have. She was finishing the kitchen when she heard the front door. The particular weight of it, not slammed, not eased shut, just closed with the practiced quiet of a man who'd learned to move through the world without announcing himself. Her back was to the entrance. She kept working. She was proud of that, later. How steady her hands were. "You're early," Caius said. He set his keys on the counter without looking at them. The gesture so automatic, it told her this was a man who'd lived alone long enough that his body had memorized every surface of this house. "Same-day request from the company," she said. "I can work around you if you need the kitchen." He looked at her for a moment. That particular brand of looking he did, where his eyes didn't move quickly over things, but settled on them. "I don't need the kitchen," he said. And then, with the same flat precision, "Have you eaten?" The question landed in the space between them with more weight than it had any right to carry. Fiona blinked. "I'm working." "That wasn't what I asked." She hadn't eaten. She'd left her apartment at 6 with half a cup of instant coffee and the particular determination of someone who doesn't leave room in the morning for anything that might slow her down. She said nothing, which was apparently answer enough, because he moved to the refrigerator with the unhurried ease of a man making a decision he'd already finished deliberating, and set a container of leftover rice and braised short rib on the counter beside her, without ceremony. No invitation, no performance of generosity. Just food, placed close enough to reach. Fiona stared at it. Something in her chest did something she didn't have a name for yet. She thought about refusing. She was genuinely, seriously considering it. And then her stomach made a sound that erased that option entirely, and the look on Caius's face, not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it, something warm hiding under the composure, made her press her lips together to keep from laughing first. She ate standing at the counter while he sat at the far end of the kitchen island with a document open in front of him, not speaking, not looking at her, or at least, not looking at her when she was looking back. But twice, when her attention dropped to the food, she felt it again. That weight. That specific pressure between her shoulder blades that his gaze seemed to carry like a physical thing. She didn't call him out on it. She filed it away in the same drawer where she kept the almost smile and the coastline photograph and the book left open in the dark. The drawer was getting full. She was starting to wonder what she planned to do about that. November deepened, and so did the rhythm between them. Fiona came on Tuesdays and Thursdays now. The schedule change had come from a lesion without explanation, and she hadn't asked for one, which told her more about herself than she was entirely comfortable with. She arrived at the same time, but nothing about it felt the same anymore. The mansion had stopped feeling like a place she was passing through, and started feeling like somewhere she was being led into, slowly, one unlocked door at a time. Caius had started being home when she arrived. Not always in the same room, not always visible, but present in the particular way a house shifts when someone is in it. A jacket over the chair that wasn't there last week. Music coming faintly from the study. The smell of coffee already in the air. He never made a production of it. He was simply there, in the way of a man who had quietly decided to stop leaving before she came, and hadn't made any announcements about it. On a gray Tuesday in the 3rd week of November, she broke a glass. It was a small thing. Her sleeve caught the edge of a crystal tumbler on the kitchen shelf, and it fell, shattering cleanly on the stone floor in that particular way that sounds louder than it should. She crouched immediately to collect the pieces and cut her finger on the shard before she'd even registered the pain. A thin, clean line across her index finger, welling red before she could pull her hand back. Caius was in the kitchen in seconds. She hadn't heard him coming, which meant he'd been closer than she'd realized. He crouched beside her without a word, took her hand by the wrist with a grip that was firm and careful at the same time, and looked at the cut with the focused attention of someone running a quick, private calculation. "It's not deep," he said, more to himself than to her. But he didn't let go of her wrist. Fiona was very aware of his hand, the warmth of it, the way his thumb rested just below her pulse point without seeming to notice, or perhaps noticing completely. She was also aware that she was not pulling away, which she noted with the detached clarity of someone watching themselves make a choice in slow motion. He brought her to the kitchen sink, ran cold water over her finger, with a patience that felt almost out of character for a man who radiated that much controlled intensity, and then dried her hand with a clean towel, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Up close, he smelled like cedar wood and cool air, and something underneath that she couldn't identify, and absolutely should not have been trying to. His jaw was close enough that she could see the faint tension in it, the small, deliberate effort of a man keeping himself very still on purpose. "I'll replace the glass," she said, because she needed to say something that was about the glass and not about any of the other things happening in that 3 feet of space between them. "I don't care about the glass, Fiona." It was the first time he'd said her name, just like that, plainly, like he'd been holding it in his mouth for a while and had finally decided it was time. He stepped back. The distance returned. But it felt different now. Not like space between strangers, but like space between two people who both know exactly how small it's become. She finished her shift without looking at him directly again, gathered her things with careful hands, and walked to the car that was waiting at the gate. She sat in the back seat in the dark and pressed her uninjured fingers against the cut on her index finger, and thought about the way he'd said her name, like it meant something he hadn't decided to explain yet. She almost called in a substitute on Thursday. She had a reason. Eli had texted the night before, something about a form he needed help with. Nothing urgent, but enough to justify a schedule shift if she'd wanted one. She stared at the Elysian app for a long moment, with her thumb over the reassign button, and then put her phone face down on the nightstand and got dressed in the dark like she always did. She wasn't going to examine that too closely. The city was still gray when she arrived, the kind of Seoul morning that feels like the sky hasn't fully committed to the day yet. But inside the mansion, something was different. There were 2 cups on the kitchen counter, not 1, 2, set side by side with the same quiet deliberateness that characterized everything Caius did, next to a small French press, still warm to the touch. Fiona stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at those 2 cups for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. Then she set down her bag, poured herself a cup without making a single comment about it, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. He found her in the sitting room 20 minutes later, where she'd finished her work and had, without entirely meaning to, sat down on the edge of the window seat with her coffee and gotten briefly, completely lost in the view. Seoul from that height on a cloudy morning looked like a watercolor someone hadn't finished. She startled when she registered his presence, moved to stand, and he said, "Don't," with the kind of low, uncomplicated authority that her body apparently responded to before her mind had a vote. She stayed. He sat in the reading chair across from her, his own cup in hand, and for a while, neither of them said anything at all. It should have been uncomfortable. It wasn't. It was the strangest, most disorienting kind of easy. The kind that made Fiona distrust it slightly, because nothing in her life had prepared her for stillness that didn't demand something from her. She was used to being useful. She was not used to being simply present with someone and having that be enough. She watched him from the corner of her eye. He was looking out the window, one hand loose around his cup, jaw relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. Unguarded, just slightly, just enough. "That coastline in the photograph," she said, before she'd made a conscious decision to speak. "Where is it?" He looked at her, not surprised, just attentive. "Geoji Island. My mother was from a village nearby." A pause, small but weighted. "I haven't been back." Fiona didn't ask why. She understood the particular silence around places you carry but can't return to. "I had a drawer full of design school letters," she said instead, an offering for an offering. "I never opened most of them." Something moved across his face. Not pity. She would have closed off immediately at pity. It was recognition. The specific, quiet recognition of one person who has swallowed a future whole, looking at another who has done the same. He set his cup down and leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and looked at her with an openness that sat completely at odds with everything the rest of him projected. Up close, in the gray morning light, his eyes were darker than she'd cataloged. Not just dark, but deep. The kind of depth that isn't emptiness, but accumulated weight. She felt the pull of it the way you feel a current before you see the water moving. "You could still go," he said quietly. "So could you," she answered. Neither of them moved. The city hummed distantly below. And then Caius reached across the space between them, not far, just enough, and touched the back of her hand where it rested on her knee. One deliberate, unhurried point of contact. No pressure, just warmth and intention, and the absolute stillness of a man who had thought carefully about this before he did it. Fiona looked down at his hand and then up at his face, and found him already watching her, that steady gaze asking nothing, and somehow saying everything. She turned her hand over slowly beneath his, and that was all. And it was not nothing. It was, in fact, the most significant thing that had happened to either of them in years, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. and the silence between them finally had a different quality entirely. Not the silence of two strangers, but the silence of two people standing at the edge of something and having just agreed, without words, to look down together. Part 6. The place he'd been looking for. The dossier arrived on a Monday, before dawn. No sender, no note, just a manila envelope with Fiona's name in the corner and photographs inside. Her entering the mansion, her at the window with her coffee. A typed page suggesting her placement at Elysian had not been coincidental, that she was gathering information for arrival. It was clean, professional, designed to feel irrefutable. Caius sat with it alone in the dark for a long time. He knew the protocol. He had followed it without hesitation for over a decade. Then he looked at the photograph of Fiona at the window, unaware of the camera, her profile soft in the gray morning light, and picked up his phone. She was at her apartment sorting through Eli's scholarship forms when he called. His voice was even and careful, and he said, "Come to the house. Not for work. I need to talk to you." Something in his tone made her fold the forms without question. He was waiting in the sitting room when she arrived, not positioned behind his desk or framed in a doorway, just standing in the middle of the room with the dossier on the table between them. He walked her through all of it, every photograph, the typed accusation, the probable source. No softening, no pacing for her comfort. Every card on the table, exactly as he'd once said. And then he looked at her and said, "I know it isn't true. I need you to know that I know." Fiona looked at the photographs for a moment. Then she looked at him. "You could have just made me disappear," she said quietly. "That would have been easier." "Yes," he said, "it would have been." The space between them closed the way it had always been going to. Not in a rush, but with the gravity of two people who had been circling the same point for weeks and had finally stopped pretending otherwise. When he reached up and touched her face, his thumb at her jaw, she leaned into it like a decision she'd already made. He kissed her slowly, with the full attention of a man who had been careful about everything for a very long time and had chosen to stop being careful about this. She felt it in her chest, in her hands, in the place where she had quietly kept every folded letter and every swallowed dream. He kissed her like she was somewhere he had been trying to find, and she kissed him back like she was finally done being invisible. Afterward, they sat together at the window, her shoulder against his arm, Seoul glittering below in the early dark. She told him about Chicago, the real version, the whole version. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You could still go. I wouldn't ask you not to." She looked at him, this guarded, quietly unmoored man who had put 2 cups on the counter and chosen her over every protocol he'd ever built, and said, "I know. That's why I'm not going anywhere." Something in his eyes settled then, like tension held too long finally released, and outside Seoul carried on in its enormous, indifferent way, while inside that room, 2 people who had each lived too long in the wrong kind of silence found, without planning to, exactly the right kind. If this story moved you, drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your rating means everything and helps more people find their way here. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Until next time.